guys have generated the largest number of protesters so far. So apparently they're opposed to violent men, which seems like a reasonable proposition. So I don't know where they expect to find them here precisely, but that's okay. So I thought I'd start by just laying out a couple of things I've been thinking about the last couple of days. I use these lectures to think, you know, and so I guess in that sense they're not exactly lectures. I really think about them more as a discussion. You know, you might think, well, it's kind of funny to term this event a discussion because I'm talking and you guys aren't talking, but that's not really true because I can look at the audience constantly and do specific people in the audience, and I can see if what I'm saying is making sense and if people are following me, and I listen to everyone in some sense, and I try to make sure that everyone's quiet because then I know I'm on track, right? Because if you're rustling around and moving and whispering to each other and so forth, then I've lost the track, and so then the discussion isn't proceeding properly, and so it's a discussion. And I've been trying to figure out, you know, I was in Vancouver, I think Dave mentioned that, talking to Sam Harris, and it was so strange because we were there 2 nights and it sold out, and the venue was about, not quite as big as this one, but pretty close, and so that meant that there was 5,000 people in Vancouver who came out to see 2, you know, guys who are basically scientists / intellectuals, I think that's the right category, talk about high-level ideas, full force, you know. The thing that I would compare it to most that I've had familiarity with before was a PhD defense. So there was about that level of discourse. Now, it wasn't exactly a PhD defense because I was defending and so was Sam, right? So it was like a dueling PhD defense. But it was so interesting to see that so many people were interested in that. You know, and we talked for an hour the first night, and then we were going to go to Q&A, but the audience didn't want us to go to Q&A. They wanted us to continue the discussion. And so we talked for about 2.5 hours, which is a long time for an intense discussion like that. And then the same thing happened the next night. And so it's really made me think, like, what the hell's going on? Why is it that this has become popular? Because it's not obvious at all why this is happening. Or what's happening with this group of people that has been termed by Eric Weinstein, this intellectual dark web. And so I've been trying to think it through, so I'll tell you what I think is happening, and you can, maybe it's useful, because obviously here you are all too, participating in whatever this is. And it's certainly a discussion about ideas, there's absolutely no doubt about that, and hopefully about crucially important ideas as well. So, the question is one question is, why in the world is a market opened up for this all of a sudden? You know, and so I was thinking, one of the things, Dave interviewed Sam Harris about 2 or 3 weeks ago on his YouTube channel, on his podcast, and one of the things Sam said, he was talking about the difference between YouTube and the podcast world, say, and the classic media, especially TV. And so TV is a really interesting medium. You know, and it's been accused of dumbing people down. And it actually hasn't, by the way. The data are quite clear. The television has made people more intelligent. And I think the reason for that is that it's taken the people who would have been most deprived without television and given them something. So imagine that your parents don't take care of you very well when you're a little kid. And so you just have nothing to do. You're just sitting in a room and you have nothing to do. It's way better to have a TV than that. And so TV was an educational tool, and you know, it might not have been the best educational tool imaginable, but it was a lot better than no educational tool at all. And so I think it pulled up the bottom end a lot. But the problem with TV, so Sam made this comment. He said, you know, if you go on John Anderson on CNN and you want to have a discussion about something important, you got 7 minutes. And then it'll affect 1 million people, say that's the top end. It's like, well, what can you discuss in 7 minutes? And the answer to that is, well, only something that you can discuss in 7 minutes. And so anything that would take longer to discuss than that turns into a parody or a soundbite or something like that. And I've had quite a bit of experience with mainstream television now, and it's really weird to go to a mainstream television studio because you get turned into processed content instantly, because the medium is so narrow band and so time limited that everything is forced into the same strange shape. And that shape is news of the second, news of the second. You know, there's no deep thought, there's no time for letting things unfold. And so it's possible that's shaped our political discourse deeply in ways that we really don't understand. Marshall McLuhan, who was a famous Canadian social commentator from the 1960s, he said, the medium is the message. And by that he meant that the technology shapes the discourse, right? Is that it has a profound effect on what can be discussed and what can't be discussed, merely because of the format, and because television, the bandwidth for television was so expensive and so narrow that it forced everything through this tiny little channel. I kind of started watching TV news about 25 years ago, and the reason for that was that I noticed increasingly that when the journalists were covering politicians, they had the politicians in the background talking with no sound, and then the journalists were saying what the politicians said, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I don't really want that kind of mediation, but the politicians became an excuse for the journalists to have an opinion, and that didn't seem to me to be very useful. And it's far worse now than it was. It's inconceivably worse now than it was then. Well, but now, so John Anderson gives you 7 minutes and you've got 1 million people, but Joe Rogan gives you 3 hours, right? Because you think, and no commercials, that's right. Well, that's the other thing, because, well, the other thing that TV really serves the commercial market. Now, there's nothing wrong with serving the commercial market, but the commercial pressure for TV, because the bandwidth is so expensive, the commercial pressure is completely overwhelming. The whole medium twists to serve the commercial market, whereas YouTube is basically free. So it frees you up from the demands, the instantaneous and continual demands of the commercial market. And so, you know, I said, well, Joe Rogan gives you 3 hours, and look at a bunch of you applauded. It's like, isn't that interesting that you're so happy for some reason about the extension of the format to 3 hours, which is really like a big chunk of time. You're so happy with the extension of the forum that just a mention of it makes you applaud. It's really something. And so it looks like what we're doing is sort of, I think we're celebrating the dawn of a new educational medium. I really do believe that. But, so one of the things that happened to me about 1.5 years ago was that, like, I put my class videos up on YouTube, because I was curious. It's like, well, why not record them and put them on YouTube? It's like, it wasn't hard. I mean, I used very primitive, well, very inexpensive technology. It's not primitive. I used an iPad and a good microphone. It's like, well, everyone has an iPad, but it's not like that's primitive technology, man. That's major league technology. And so, but the production cost was very low, and it was unmediated. And you know, and I'd done a little bit of work for public television in Canada, so I was a little bit familiar with the television world. And there was a bit of a market for what I was doing in Ontario, and that was quite interesting because they were high-level lectures. So I thought, oh, what the hell, I'll throw all this stuff up on YouTube, because I'm curious. That was the real reason. And I wanted to play with a new technology, and the best way to learn a new technology is actually to use it, right? So I thought, oh, I'll put these up. And so I started putting up my videos in 2013, and then by the beginning of 2016, in April, it hit 1 million views. And I thought, because I'm a quantitative guy. I've done statistics for a long time, and I mean, psychology is an intense field that intensely uses statistics, and so I'm really interested in numbers. And I hit 1 million views, and I thought, okay, what exactly does that mean? Like, if you publish a scientific paper and you get 1,000 citations, you've hit it out of the park, man. That's like 0.1% of scientific papers gives you 1,000 citations. And if you publish a book and you sell 1 million copies, it's like you're doing a football touchdown dance in the hallway, right, where no one can see you, hopefully. And 1 million of anything is a lot. And I thought, okay, well, now I've got 1 million views on YouTube. What
What am I supposed to think about that? Because we don't understand YouTube metrics. What does it mean to have a million views? It's a lot. What does it signify? How much influence do you have? What difference is it making? You know, when people were watching a fair chunk of the lectures, the average was 20 minutes. It's a stupid statistic, the average. You don't want that. You want the typical viewing duration. And that's not the average, because most people would click in for 10 seconds, right? But some people are watching the whole thing. It's like, okay, now I've got an audience. It's 1 million people. The only reason they're watching the videos is because they want to learn. That's it, right? There's no other reason, because there's no credit given for it. So it's the perfect audience if you're a university professor, because who else would you want to talk to other than people who want to listen, right? Otherwise, it's a lie. You're lecturing to people who don't want to be there, and they don't want to be there. It's like, that's just not helpful, but this is perfect. So I thought, okay, well, it's 1 million. What the hell is this? What is this YouTube thing? Because I thought it's a place, it's a repository for cute cat videos, is kind of what I thought about it. And then I thought, well, wait a second, here's something cool. So, you know, it was only about 400 years ago, 500 years ago, something approximating that Gutenberg invented the movable type press, right? All of a sudden, we had books. I mean, there were books before, but they were hand-copied, and they were often on leather. I mean, they were staggeringly expensive, right? To have a library meant you were one rich person, and most people didn't have books. It didn't matter anyways, because they couldn't read. So, but the printing press came along, and all of a sudden, you could multiply knowledge, and everyone had access to it. So that was a big deal, and that was a major deal. I mean, it caused all sorts of revolutions, and it raised the average, well, the average intelligence of people immensely. But now, look what's happened is all of a sudden, we're in a world where the spoken word now has the same reach as the printed word. That's never, ever happened before. And so then you can think, so that's a major league revolution. I thought, oh, I see that YouTube, that's a Gutenberg revolution. That's not a repository for cute cat videos. That's an absolutely transformative technological revolution. So that's one revolution. It's like the spoken word now has the reach of the written word, but it's cheaper to produce and it's faster. And so it has advantages over the written word. Because, like, if you're going to write a book, first of all, forget it, because no one's going to buy your book. And I mean no publisher is going to buy your book, so it's impossible. And then even if you do publish your book with a good publisher, which isn't going to happen, the probability that anyone will buy it is basically zero. So the barrier to books is unbelievably high, and there's some utility in that because it keeps out a lot of terrible books. But the barrier on YouTube is there's no barrier. You can move from conception to publication in like 1 day. And so that's absolutely that's another technological revolution. You have the permanence of print with the reach of print with no lag whatsoever and at no cost. It's like, okay, that's really something. And then there's another technological revolution that's been laid on top of that. So, you know, with Rogan's podcast on YouTube, he has a pretty decent YouTube, and I'm using Rogan because I think he's, in some sense, used the YouTube podcast combination for large-scale, long-format intellectual discourse better than anyone else. He has a big YouTube following, and, you know, he'll put a video up and it can get 3 million views. You know, the top-end videos that he does get 3 million views. But that pales in comparison to the podcasts. The podcasts get 10 times that. And so Rogan gets 100, the last time I talked to him, and this was like 6 months ago, so it's probably more than this now, he gets 150 million downloads a month. It's approximately 1.5 billion downloads a year. He's the most powerful interviewer that ever lived. So and I asked him, I said, what do you think? Joe, you're the most powerful interviewer that ever lived. What do you think about that? He says, I don't ever think about it. And it's understandable, because what do you think about that? No one knows what to think about that. What would you think about that? It's like, what's that supposed to mean? It's like, he just does what he does, and he doesn't really think about it. But see, one of the things that's happened with the podcast that's cool, and this is transforming the book market at the moment, is that this is the other part of the technological revolution. You can't read and drive. You can't read and do dishes. You can read and exercise, but not reading. You can't read and walk, but you can listen to podcasts and you can do all those things. And so what that has also done is it's taken a technology that's essentially book-like, So, and we've already talked about that technological transformation, and it's transformed into something that you can use in found time. So it's like the audio podcast world has added an hour and a half to everyone's day that they can do nothing but learn with. And that's actually what people are doing. Like I see my graduate students, for example, who are highly literate people. Many of them are listening to podcasts instead of reading. And of course, they turn up the speed so they can listen. Because I don't know how fast you listen to a podcast or a YouTube video. 1.5 seems to kind of top out for me, unless the speaker is very slow, because it starts to get muffled after that. But you can double the speed approximately with no real problem. And a lot of these younger people are listening to podcasts instead of listening to music. And that's also really something, because music's been an unbelievably dominant cultural force, partly because of it's been distributed so widely for about 60 years, but the audio world seems to be encroaching on that, and you can see this also happening in the book publishing market. So Audible's become a real force, and the audiobooks have started to compete with hardcover and paperback books in terms of pure volume of books sold. So that means that people are listening to books now instead of reading them. And then there's another interesting thing that's happening there. It's like, maybe, most people don't read much. And of the people who do read, hardly anyone buys books. So book buying is a very niche market. But maybe that's because there's some barriers to reading. You have to be a very, very fluent reader to buy difficult nonfiction, generally speaking. But maybe 10 times as many people can listen to difficult nonfiction as can read it. It might be, and if it's 10 times as many people, that's also a major technological revolution, because it would mean that all of a sudden high-end intellectual material that was the province of a very small minority of people has all of a sudden capable of reaching an audience of maybe 10 times that. And so I've been running all that through my head. I said, okay, well, what's the nature of this revolution? It's like 4 revolutions at the same time. And so then I was just talking to Dave backstage, because we've been talking about this, this intellectual dark web idea, and the tension that's developed. Perhaps we're inside it, so it's hard to see it objectively. But the tension that's developed between this new media, podcast, YouTube, let's say, and the journalism that's taking place online as well, plays a role in that, versus the classic media, especially the television stations and so forth. It's like YouTube offers absolutely everything that television offers, plus a bunch more. So it has all the advantages of television and none of the disadvantages. And then it offers immense bandwidth at no cost. So I can't see how it can possibly not win completely. And so I think that part of the reason that you're all here, for example, and that whatever this is happening, and that there's an emergent market for high-level intellectual discourse, who the hell would have ever guessed that, is because the technology that underlies YouTube and podcasts is so powerful. It's not even the content. It's not the fact that it's Dave Rubin or Joe Rogan or me or Ben Shapiro or any of the people who seem to have, harnessed this. We were in the right place at the right time in some sense, but the underlying technology is such a monster that it's going to just change everything. And so wouldn't it be something if we're in an era now where masses of people are really willing to engage in high-level intellectual and philosophical discourse? And it kind of looks like that might be the case. So who knows for how long the hunger for this has been developing. It could easily be for decades. I think you saw a little bit of that starting maybe with talk radio, right? Because talk radio was at least longer format, but it still didn't have the same massive advantages that YouTube and podcasts have. Well, the other advantage, of course, they have is it's on demand, right? You can access it whenever you want. And so that's a lot of technological revolutions all piled into one thing. So hopefully, maybe this is the case. Maybe this will make us all smarter. I mean, it's possible. So, because it was just shocking to be in Vancouver and to see. It was so interesting participating with the audience, because the thing that I did with Harris was build this kind of a debate, like combat in some sense, was Harris had his point and I had my point, and one of us was going to win. Neither of us were really actually interested in that, although that could have happened and might have been okay. But what happened instead was that we actually had a discussion. Harris is a smart guy, and he's got his points, man. And so we actually had a discussion about what it was that he thought and what it was that I thought, and then we were trying to push what we both thought way further along, and it's actually what we were doing. It wasn't a game or anything like that. And what was so interesting was the audience was 100% on board with that. That seemed to be carrying, because there's something going on that attracts people's interest in a forum like this too. There's something going on. Now what I think is going on is that everyone loves to participate in, well, I've called it the logos. So the logos is the capacity of free and truthful speech to conquer chaos and to further the generation of habitable order, right? It's the manner in which we participate in creation itself. I would say that's a religious take on it. I think it's extraordinarily accurate. And I think that's what people are doing in a forum like this when it's working properly. Is we're all here to see if we can expand our competence outward into what we don't know a little bit more, and we can restructure what we do know so that we're more competent people. And then I think that participating in that process there isn't anything more gripping than that. And there shouldn't be, because what else could you possibly do that would be better than to make yourself competent across a broader territory and restructure the tools you already have at hand so that they're sharper and that they work better? It's like, why would you be interested in doing anything other than that? And then you see, well, people actually really are interested in it. And then I think maybe some of the contempt that seems to have been generated, like one of the things I've seen, the mainstream journalist types particularly, not all of them, I'm not trying to paint them all with the same brush, because it's not fair to do that. There's lots of credible journalists, but one of the things I have noticed, and I've noticed this more among TV journalists, I would say, than print journalists, is that they have quite a bit of contempt for their audience. You know, they think of their audience as stupid. And then I think, why is that? It's because it might be because the medium has made the audience stupid. It's so, like, if I can only get your attention for 6 minutes, and that's at the absolute limit of, you know, if I'm very influential, maybe I can get your attention for 6 minutes once every 6 months. It's like, I'm not going to think much of your intelligence, you know, because I'm viewing you through an unbelievably narrow channel. Whereas all of a sudden now you can view people through this incredibly wide channel. It's like, well, I can talk to you for 30 hours, right? And so that's a whole different issue. We can go into things way more deeply as a consequence of that. And the Audible people talked to me this week, and they said that, because they're experimenting with the audio format now too, and they said that people seem to like, the minimum chunk that people want is 9 hours. Right? Well, and then look at what's happening on venues like Netflix. It's like, it turns out you guys don't want half-hour sitcoms. You want 40-hour, unbelievably complicated dramas, right? Right. So people have done content analysis of the development of TV shows across time, and this has really accelerated in the last 4 or 5 years. So television shows are way more complex than they used to be, right? Way more characters, way more plot lines, way more complicated plot lines developing across very long spans of time. And people seem to absolutely love that. I mean, how many of you have binge watched a whole series? Yeah, so that can be, well, minimum of a dozen hours, something like that. And the more twisty the plot lines and the more complexly layered the characterizations, all of that, the better. That's pretty interesting too, because it starts to mean that the deep narratives that are being produced on places like Netflix, also freed of the bandwidth problem, you know, they're starting to approach the same complexity as great literature. So that's cool. So it could easily be that we're actually smarter than we think. You know, we're smarter than we've revealed ourselves to be through our previous technology. And so that would be really cool. And maybe we could have a sophisticated discourse over the next 10 years. And I think maybe that's what all of this is. I think it's the beginning of widespread sophisticated discourse that's mediated by this exceptional technology. And so Well, wouldn't that be something that would be so cool if it was true? And it looks like it. It's like, you know, this is a big audience for something like this. 3,000 people, that's a lot of people. And so, and the forums in Dublin and London that I'm going, because I'm doing the last 2 talks with Seth Harris, one in Dublin and one in London, they're 5,000 expandable to 10,000. So, you know, I don't know how far we'll go into, I think we sold about 5,000 seats in Dublin. I don't know what that will expand to. Maybe by the time the talks occur, that would be on the 14th of July. But there's obviously a massive market for this. So it's so interesting, and it looks like it's so good. It might be that people are way more sophisticated than we think, and that we can elevate our political and our philosophical discourse way above what we're accustomed to. And that this is the start of that. So, I'm going to start with, I'm going to move now to discuss Rule 1 in 12 Rules for Life. And it's a rule I've hit multiple times because I've been working on it a lot, but it's also, there's things about the way that I've been conceptualizing this rule that have actually changed as a consequence of the discussion that I had with Harris. So I'm going to twist some of that into this tonight. So in 12 Rule, in the book, the chapter that's received the most satirical attention, let's see, and the most vicious criticism in some sense, is the first chapter, which kind of surprised me. I thought the 5th chapter was going to be the one that would do me in, and that's the one that's, don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. I figured I was dead in the water for publishing that, because, well, first of all, I made the claim that children can be dislikable, which is self-evidently true, but not something we're ever supposed to say. And then the other thing that's completely taboo about that title is that you could be a parent and not like your children, which is also obviously true. But another thing that you're not supposed to say. So I thought the combination of those two would be just deadly. But I got a whole pass for Rule 5. But the whole lobster thing, man, people have been up in arms about that. So, and I didn't expect that at all. But I do understand why. I do understand why, I think. And talking to Harris made it even clearer. So I'm going to lay out the underpinnings of Rule 1 and tell you, first of all, why I wrote it the way that I did write it. See, I've been trying to figure out what our fundamental political debate is about. Now, one of the things that psychologists have learned in the last 10 years or so, we sorted out the space to describe personality about 30 years ago. It started in the early 1960s, but we had a pretty stable model of personality by the early 1990s. And so the model is the standard Big 5 personality model. Extroversion, it's a positive emotion dimension. Neuroticism, it's a measure of sensitivity to negative emotion, especially anxiety and emotional pain. Agreeableness, which seems to be on the pro-agreeable side, sort of compassion and politeness, and on the less agreeable side, sort of toughness and bluntness. Conscientiousness, that's dutifulness, industriousness, and orderliness. And openness to experience, which looks like a creativity dimension. Now, those dimensions were extracted out from large-scale surveys using blunt force statistics. No theory, except the only theory that underlies the Big 5 is the idea that the structure of personality might be encapsulated in language, right? That personality is so important that we've actually built it into our linguistic system. So if you analyze the language, you can extract out the dimensions of personality. That was the only theory. And then it was brute force statistics that did the extraction of the dimensions. And then, and that was all sorted out by about 1992, 1993. And most psychologists, I mean, we were debating still about the precise details of the Big 5 model, but most people accept the notion that insofar as you can measure personality with questionnaires, then it has approximately a 5-dimensional structure. And so maybe it's 6, maybe it's 7, but it's certainly at least 5. And then once we got that sorted out, we could look at other issues like, well, were there personality differences between men and women? And there are. And then we could decide whether those were biological or cultural. And they're both, but there's certainly a heavy biological influence. And we can also start looking at political belief. And so there's been a burgeoning field, probably about 10 years in development now, showing that you vote your temperament. Now it's quite interesting because what you think is you look at the facts and then you have a rational discussion with yourself and you come to your reasoned conclusions, and that's why you're a Republican or a Democrat, let's say. But it doesn't really look like that, because being a Republican is actually heritable, so it's under biological influence, which is quite interesting. Same with being a Democrat. And it's also very tightly associated with your temperament. Not perfectly, and it's not like you don't think about things politically, but you see, the thing about your temperament is it tends to serve as a screen for the facts. So you think, well, I look at the facts and I derive my conclusions, but what you don't take into account is, well, where do you look for the facts, right? Because you just don't look randomly everywhere for facts. You have your places to go for facts, and that sort of biases what facts you'll see. And then something in you highlights certain facts as worthy of your attention and others as not, and that's your temperament. So it's really hard to get access to the facts independently of your temperament. And your temperament basically provides you with a quick and dirty way of interacting with the world. So like if you're extroverted, for example, you're going to exploit the world insofar as the world is social and you're a social being. And if you're agreeable, then you're going to orient your life around relationships. And if you're conscientious, then you're going to orient your life around duty. And if you're open and creative, then you're going to organize your life around entrepreneurial and creative activity. And so those are your niches. And it's not exactly that that's your choice, although that enters into it. It's like that's who you are. And if you have children, especially if you have a couple of them, you can see how different their temperaments are right from very, very early. You can really see it, I think, right away, but you can certainly see it by 6 months. So anyways, it turns out that your political choices are very heavily influenced by your temperament. And so this is how it works. So if you're liberal, you're likely to be high in trait openness, which is the creativity dimension, but low in trait conscientiousness. And so that's industriousness and orderliness. And if you're conservative, it's the reverse. You tend to be high in conscientiousness and low in openness. And then that has occupational significance. So what that means is the liberals tend to be the creative types. Artistic, writers, the whole artistic domain. Plus, they tend to be the entrepreneurs. Whereas the conservative types tend to be managers and administrators. And so there's an interesting kind of economic rule that goes along with that, which I think everyone should think about for like about 10 years, which is that conservatives and liberals actually need each other in an economic sense, because the liberals think up all the new companies, but they're too scatterbrained to run them. Right, exactly. And the conservatives can really run something like mad once they know what it is, but they can't think up anything new to run. So liberals start companies and conservatives run them. So that's quite it. And so those are different niches in some sense, right? So the liberals are the people in some sense who are out on the fringe, and they're dealing with new ideas continually. And the fact that they're low in conscientiousness is actually somewhat of a plus in that domain, because one of the things that characterizes entrepreneurs is that as they're pursuing their new technology, they have to be willing to break rules. Because, if you're doing something new, you can't do it the old way. But if you're a conscientious person, dutiful, industrious, and orderly, then it's really going to bother you to break rules, because you think those damn rules are there for a reason, which they are. And so you should have a good reason for breaking them, right? But for an entrepreneurial type, it's like, well, I need to get this done, and I'm pursuing what I'm interested in. The stupid rules can wait. And then you need, of course, the conservative types to kind of mop up behind you and make sure that you implement things properly. So that's worth doing, because if you're really liberal, and you see the world through that lens, you still might think, yeah, but we need these damn annoying conservatives, because we would never be able to implement something. We'd never get something running stably. We'd never have anyone to pay attention to the details, the painful details, if we didn't have conservatives. And the conservatives need to think, well, yeah, it's really good to do things the tried and true way and by the book and so forth, and in a disciplined and militaristic, say, patriotic, orderly manner, but now and then we're going down the wrong path in a very efficient way, and we need someone to, well, that happens a lot, man, that happens a lot. It happened to Japan, right, because Japan was unbelievably on the ascendancy up till the 80s, and they ossified, and they don't have a very entrepreneurial culture. I mean, the Japanese are doing fine, but they don't have a very entrepreneurial culture. You know, and one of the things that you Americans have got brilliantly, and I don't really know how you managed it, was that, you know, the managerial and administrative types can run corporations, but you let creative people knock the corporations away when they're no longer useful and produce a new one. And so that's painful for everyone, right? Especially people in the old corporations, but it's absolutely necessary. So then you think there's a fundamental tension there, right? A fundamental tension that's never going to go away. And that tension is between old structures and their utility and new structures and their necessity. So the liberals are always clamoring about new structures and their necessity, and the conservatives are always clamoring about how we need to preserve the old tradition. And what's horrible about that is they're both absolutely right. And so here's another way of thinking about it. It's like, so there's an intractable problem here. It will never go away. And the problem is, you need structures to orient you in the world. But the structures become old and out of date, and they need to be updated and sometimes abolished. And so then the question is, when do you preserve and when do you transform? And the answer to that is, you don't know and you never will. And the reason for that is that, well, this is the big problem. So you don't know and you never will. And the answer is why? Or the question is, why is that? Why can't you solve this problem? And the answer is, well, because the environment keeps shifting on you, unpredictably. Here's a good example. Try to predict the stock market. It's like, good luck, you can't. You can't. If you do random selection, that's about as good as you can do. So this has been tested over and over. So like if you take, say you take a cohort of money managers, and you look at how they do in terms of stock market investment over a 5-year period, you find that if a random selection process will beat them on average. Money managers do worse than random on average. And the reason for that is because the stock market is actually unpredictable. And the reason for that is that even if you got an edge and you could predict it for like a minute or let's say an hour, someone is going to figure out that you're predicting it, and they're going to change their behavior, and that'll screw up your prediction model immediately. So the stock market is twisting around and moving. And the reason I'm using it as an example is because it's a good analog of the environment as such. The environment's unpredictable, fundamentally. And you know that. You all know that, because you can have a good plan, and you can be laying it out, and something can come along and broadside you, right? Something you didn't expect. You'll get ill, your family member will get ill, you know, your boss will turn out to be a psychopath, someone that you have a relationship with will betray you. Like, things are coming up in life, or there'll be a radical political event that flips everything upside down, or you just have no idea. And so you can't predict the environment perfectly, and it's shifting around. And so what that means is you can never tell when the structure that you're using needs to be preserved and when it needs to be updated. It's like, should I preserve this? Should I continue what I'm doing? Or should I change it? It's like you've been in that agonizing position when you want to change partners, let's say, when you want to change your educational pathway, when you want to change your career. Should I keep doing what I'm doing? Or should I do something new and better? It's like, you don't know. You don't know. So how do you solve the problem? You think. So that's why you have to think. Because you might think, well, why do you have to think? Well, you have to think because what you already thinking isn't good enough. Because if what you already knew was good enough, you'd never have to think. You could just be who you were, and you'd run that out like a clock, and everything would work out fine for you. It's like, that doesn't work at all. You're thinking all the time. And what are you thinking about usually? You're usually thinking about problems. And the reason for that is because you have problems. And the reason for that is you can't predict everything. So you've got a problem. Okay, so we got to think. So then the next question is, how do we think? And the answer to that is, you think badly. And so do you, and so do you, and so do I. And the reason for that is, well, how can you not think badly? First of all, things are way more complicated than you are smart. So that's a massive problem.
And you know that, right? It's like, it's obvious that, and it doesn't really matter how smart you are, you still have that problem. But it's worse too, because you're biased, partly by your temperament, partly by your blindness, partly by your malevolence, partly by your stupidity, partly by your ignorance. Like, you've got major cognitive problems, man. Like, they just stack up, right? So even if you can, and this is also assuming that you know how to think, and you probably don't, because thinking is actually really hard. So to think something through, it's very rare to see someone who can do this. If you have a complex problem, and you want to think it through, you have to really define what the problem is. And so that might mean you have to define it 6 or 7 ways, and those ways will contradict one another. Having one opinion about some complex thing that you're trying to think through isn't thinking at all. It's just the application of your assumptions. To think, you have to take 6 different stances on the same thing. And then you have to have a fight between those, and you have to do that internally. And man, it takes a long time to train someone to do that. And even if you do train them, they can usually only do it within the domain that they're trained in. And most people aren't trained to do that, and so most of us can't think. So, not by ourselves. That's the crucial issue. Not by ourselves. So then the question is, well then how do we think? And the answer to that is by talking. And that's what made me a free speech advocate. You see, because that's how we think. So, okay, so you can think about this technically first. I know you can think in images, and some people do, but a lot of the way we think is in words. I think, well, how did we learn the words? Well, obviously by speaking. Right? And you don't just sit in your crib and babble to yourself. You learn language by communicating with other people. So what that means is the very tools that you use to think, if you're just thinking, are still social, right? Because they're derived from social interaction. So the tools that you use to think, even as an individual, are social tools. So even when you're thinking that you think by yourself, you're not. But even more to the point, look, if you have a family is a thinking unit. Okay, so how? Well, you're always talking to each other. Now, verbally and non-verbally. And you're jostling, right? So you imagine that the family it's like a group of sailors that are trying to figure out how to determine how the ship is going to progress across the stormy seas, right? And everyone is talking to each other to determine how the navigation is going to go. And the talking's intense. Some of it's just the sharing of ideas, but a lot of it's arguing and fighting. It's like, I want to do this, you know, I want to do this, you know, I want to do this. Like, it's contentious, you know, and maybe you're not so good at it, and one person's voice always dominates, and it's a bit of a tyranny, which is a bad idea. It's not a good long-term stable solution for your family. So what happens is that everybody voices their opinion, if it's working out, and as a consequence of voicing those diverse opinions, then you come to some sort of consensus, and you assume that the consensus is a better arrangement than anything you might have come up with on your own. Better because more people had input, right? So that's good, because they can take you away from your biases, right? So you want to have people around you who aren't the same as you in case your stupid bias doesn't work in this situation. Because there's places where your bias is going to work, but there's places where it's not going to work at all. So like if you're the entrepreneurial type and you have to make conscientious, dutiful, and orderly decisions, you're not the person to be thinking about those. You need someone that you don't even want to talk to help you with that. So you put together a family unit, say everybody's communicating, and hopefully what comes out of that communication, if it's truthful communication, and everyone is engaged in it with an eye to making things better, let's say, what emerges out of that is a pathway that's better than any of the pathways that any of the individuals would have come up with had they been on their own. And that's kind of self-evident, because why the hell would you have a family otherwise? Like, if it's a worse solution than being alone, then why bother with it? So, and it isn't. I mean, the data on that are pretty clear. You know, it's for example, people who are in long-term relationships do better.
generally speaking, than people who are single. Now, that's partly because the people who are single, some of the people who are single are sick in many ways, and that's making it difficult for them to find a partner. So, you know, it's a two-way issue, but it still does seem better for people to be in a relationship, which is kind of why most of us are searching for a relationship, right? And usually it's medium to long-term relationship. And then you see in that dyadic interaction the same thing. So I'll tell you a little story. This is a very cool idea. I'll go lateral here for a minute and deeper, because I want to show you how some of this has a metaphorical underpinning as well. Because I'm trying to also make the case that the truth that you express in speech is the thinking that redeems pathological structures and that stretches us farther into the unknown. It's really, really important. I would say that's actually, that idea has been encapsulated in our deepest stories. So let me give you an example, in ways we don't even understand. It's encapsulated so deeply that we don't even know we've done it. And so the stories that I'm thinking about are at the base of our culture, because our culture is predicated on the idea that you're actually a locus of invaluable communicative capacity. And that's why our society is grounded in respect for your sovereignty as an individual. It's a very, very deep, fundamental idea. I had this friend who went to Sweden to get married. And in the marriage ceremony, it was a Christian marriage ceremony, the bride and the groom had to hold a candle above both of them, right, while they were taking their vows. You think, okay, well, what the hell's going on there exactly? So it's a dramatic ritual, right? It's like a play in some sense. It's even like the things that kids do when they're pretending. It's a play. What does the candle represent? Well, it represents the same thing that the candle represents if you put it on a Christmas tree. Now, you have a Christmas tree at the darkest time of the year, right? Because that's around December 21st. And so the light needs to come back at the darkest possible time. And so the tree signifies, the tree with the lights on it, that's what it signifies. It signifies the re-emergence of illumination in the darkness. And illumination is associated with light. And so the light is the candle, and the candle is the thing that you hold above both people in a marital relationship as the value to which they both bow. Because you might say, well, who's subordinate to who in a marriage? You can have a big fight about that. Well, if it's a patriarchal marriage, then the man's in control. And if it's a matriarchal situation, then the woman's in control. But someone has to be in control, or something has to be in control. It's like, no, not necessarily. It could be a process that you're both engaged in, that you're both subordinate to. And that's what that ceremony represents. It's the idea is, no, you're both subordinate to the principle of illumination. It's like, yes, that's what you want to be subordinate to, that's for sure. So it isn't that I have to abide by what you want, and it's not that you have to abide by what I want. It's that both of us should be oriented towards the future, the positive future, and then both of us should be telling the truth, and then that will produce a kind of dialogue, and we're both going to abide by the consequence of that dialogue. So we're subordinate to this higher order principle of illumination. Now, because I said already this was a Christian ceremony, the illuminated candle was assimilated to the idea of Christ. And so the notion there, and this is an extraordinary old notion, it's the notion of the sacrality of marriage. And so the idea there is that the principle of illumination is what unites a man and a woman in a proper relationship. And the principle of illumination is associated symbolically with the idea of Christ. And so then the question is, well, then this is where this gets insanely complicated. It's very, very difficult to lay out. So then what is that superordinate principle as it's encapsulated in that symbolic structure? Okay, so it's not illumination as a mere verbal abstraction. Okay, so it's not just something that's abstract, it's something that you have to act out. So it's not only that we've formulated this relationship that puts us both, it subordinates us both to the truth. It isn't that we're only supposed to speak and think the truth, it's that we're supposed to act it out. And so that's the idea that the word should be made flesh. That's what that idea means, that it has to be acted out. And so the symbolic reference for Christ in the Christian system that at least in part underlies our culture is the idea that the truth needs to be embodied in action, That's right. And that's what you're supposed to be subordinate to. And that's the principle that revitalizes and unifies. So that's that. So that's that set of ideas. Okay, so now back to the idea of free speech. So the reason that free speech is an inviolable responsibility, we always think about it as a right. It's like, it's not the right way to think about it. It's actually a responsibility. You have the right to free speech because we need you to speak properly, because if you don't speak properly, then you can't set the world right, and we lose your perspective, and that's a very bad thing. And so you have the right to free speech so that you can adopt the responsibility to speak freely and truly, so that you can set things in order and we can hear what you have to say. And that's really how it's laid out. And the reason that we need free speech is because it's through free speech that we think, because we can't think on our own. And we need to think because we can't update our traditions and our structures, and we can't transform ourselves when we're necessary unless we can think. And so that means that unless we have free speech, then the process by which we stop our structures from degenerating, and we don't want them to degenerate. It's a bad thing, right? Because they can rigidify and become tyrannical, and God, that's horrible. Or they can dissolve and disappear, in which case, what have you got? You got nothing. You've got nihilism, you've got hopelessness, you've got aimlessness, you've got the suffering of life but no purpose. Well, that's no good. No one can live. We can't live with those two extremes. We can't live in the tyrannical extreme when everything is structured and nothing gets too updated. It gets too old and dead and kills everything. And we can't live with the dissolution of structure either, because then we have nothing. And so we have to keep the structure alive. And the way we keep the structure alive is by talking about it. But we have to talk about it properly. We have to talk about it like civilized, intelligent, committed citizens who take the responsibility that goes along with individual sovereignty as if it's the most important thing there is. Because it is. And so maybe that's why it's so good that we're engaging in this sort of dialogue, and the forum for that has started to expand. Because, you know, right now there's any amount of political pathology tormenting our culture, I would say, both on the left, on the right, and it's destabilizing us. And, you know, the left pathology tilts towards chaos and nihilism, and the right pathology tilts towards tyrannical order. And we've had experiences of those recently enough, we might think, let's say throughout the 20th century, so that we might have learned our lesson and figured out that if we could negotiate between those two extremes, wouldn't that be much better for everyone? And then, of course, the question there is, do you want things to be much better for everyone? You know, and you might think, well, obviously the answer to that is yes. It's like, it's not so obvious, right? It's not, you know perfectly well if you sit on the edge of your bed and you have a little meditative discourse with yourself, discussion with yourself, that your motivations are far from pure. And the probability is that some of the time that you're aiming down and not up for whatever purposes you might have, revenge or anger or hostility or trauma or resentment or whatever it is, whatever chip you're carrying on your shoulder, whatever way you feel victimized by your unfortunate circumstances. And they are unfortunate, right? Let's make no mistake about that. You know, when people consider themselves victimized, it's often because, well, life is extraordinarily difficult and tragedy strikes everyone, and we're often betrayed and we're subject to malevolence, and it's no bloody wonder that we wander around with chips on our shoulder, but it isn't helpful at all. And so that's why the rule in 12 Rules for Life is, well, twofold. It's to stand up straight with your shoulders back, because that is an injunction to adopting a certain, what would you say, physical stance towards the world that, at least in principle, can undergird this psychological stance that I described. It's like, well, you have to be willing to take the whole force of the world onto yourself in some sense, and it's a catastrophe. But if you don't take it on, then you can't solve the damn problem. And you don't do that by crouching and hiding, and you don't do that by adopting an aggressive stance. Like, there are times when those things are useful, but fundamentally that's not it. Fundamentally, you open yourself up to the world, right? And that's what this stance is to put your shoulders back. And because it's to expose yourself, in some sense, to the full force of the world. You know, and the chapter's been criticized because I made a case for hierarchies, I said, which is a classic conservative case. And although I wasn't trying to say that hierarchies are immutable or appropriate in their current form or anything like that, it's a complete misreading of, an absolute misreading of what I was trying to put forward. I was trying to put forward the proposition that you have to have structure. You can't interact with the world without structure. It's not possible. This is actually the argument. The argument that I ended up having with Sam Harris was really about something like this. It's like, we have to have structure. What does the structure look like? Well, we're still debating that. But there are ways to solve that. I address some of them in 12 Rules for Life. You have to have structure, but structure tilts towards tyranny. So that's the right-wing conundrum. You need structure, but it tilts towards tyranny. And the left-wing conundrum is, well, if you have structure, then it produces all sorts of negative consequences. So hierarchical structures, for example, emerge when you're trying to pursue something that's valuable, which you need to do. You pursue something that's valuable, and it turns out that some people are better at that than others, whatever the valuable thing is. So you get inequality. As soon as you pursue something of value in a social circumstance, you get inequality, because some people are better at it than others. You know that. Plumbers. Some plumbers are better at being plumbers than other plumbers. And all plumbers are better at being plumbers than people who aren't plumbers. So you've got that inequality. Right, you've got that inequality built right in. It's a major inequality. If you have a skill, then you produce inequality in the world. It's like, well, what are you going to do? Get rid of all the skills? That's not going to be helpful. So the necessary consequence of developing specialized skill is the generation of inequality. And so if you're going to benefit from the fact that people have skills, you're going to have to accept the damn inequality. Okay, so that's what the right-wingers are always on about. It's like, you have to accept the damn inequality if you're going to benefit from the skill. And fair enough. But the left-wingers say, yeah, but there's something important that you're forgetting here, which is that if you produce a hierarchy, even if it's skill-based, then most people aren't going to benefit from that hierarchy. The benefits are going to go to a small percentage of people at the top, or they're going to go disproportionately to a small number of people at the top, and that's also the case. So another part of the political dialogue that has to be continually active is, okay, how much inequality can we tolerate to benefit from the differential in skill? And the answer to that is the same answer as the answer to the problem of structure versus transformation. It's like, there is no answer. You have to debate it all the time. It's like, so the people who are on the side of the structure have to say, well, here's all the benefits to the structure. It's worth paying a cost for, and the cost is the dispossession of the people who stack up at the bottom. And the left says, don't go too far with that, because if your structure gets too steep and too rigid, then the whole thing will collapse. It's like, yes. So how do we mediate between those two catastrophes? And the answer is, we talk to each other and we think. And so the political landscape looks like it's set up to do two things. And one is to help us determine what parts of the structure we can maintain and move forward with, and what parts we have to transform. That's an active dialogue. And then the other part is to determine if we've got the hierarchies adjusted such that we're maximally benefiting from the skill, but minimally dispossessing people. And part of the problem is because you bring your biases to the damn argument, and you can't help it, is that if you're a conservative type, you're going to think, well, if the conservatives would just win the argument once and for all, then we wouldn't have a problem. And the liberals think if those damn conservatives would just go away, and the liberals could arrange the world, you know, we'd have the utopia tomorrow. And the problem with that is we wouldn't. And the reason for that is, well, as soon as you generate up your utopia, whatever it is, it turns into a structure, and then it has the same problems as all the other structures have ever had. And so there's no, you know, one of the things I outlined, I have this book that you might be interested in. If you like 12 Rules for Life, you might be interested in the other book I wrote, which was called Maps of Meaning, and I've done a bunch of lectures about maps of meaning online. And I just released the audio version of that on June 12th. And it's, I think, if you're going to tackle that book, it's better to tackle the audio version because it's a really, really hard book. It just about killed me to write it. So it'll probably just about kill you to read it. So, so it was sort of actually designed for that purpose, by the way. It's not so funny, it's actually true. So, but the audio version, I think, makes it much clearer. But what I was trying to outline in that book was what would you say? The fact that this set of problems that I just laid out for you, although I didn't describe it in quite this way, it's a permanent problem. It will never go away. And one of the ways I did that was I looked at the ancient Egyptian cosmology. So the Egyptians had sets of gods, and they actually had gods that represented these processes. So one of their gods was Osiris, and he was the god of tradition. And Osiris had a problem, and this is a problem you're all familiar with because you've seen it in movies. So Osiris was the once great king who had an evil advisor. It was his brother. So that was the Egyptian setup, just like the setup in The Lion King. It's exactly the same thing with Mufasa and Scar. It's the same story, fundamentally. And so what the Egyptians had figured out 4,000 years ago was that every structure, so every king, tended towards malevolence, that was its evil brother, and then the malevolence would undermine it at some point, because that's what happens in the Egyptian cosmology, is the god Seth. Osiris is the god of structure. There's a god named Seth, who's the evil brother of Osiris. His name turns into Satan over time. So it starts as Seth, it's Seth, and then it's turned into Satan. So that's kind of where that idea comes from. It's absolutely fascinating. Seth waits for Osiris to have a weak moment, and he cuts him up into pieces and distributes him across the kingdom. So things fall apart. That's what the Egyptians figured out. Things fall apart. And they do that of their own accord, but we speed them along by being malevolent. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And so that's what happens in the Egyptian story. And things fall apart, and then the goddess of chaos emerges. That's Isis. And she makes herself pregnant with the phallus of Osiris. So he's broken up across and spread out across the country. Things fall apart. But that's potential, right? When things fall apart, there's new potential. It emerges out of the chaos. That's Isis. Isis gives birth to a new god, Horus. And you all know about Horus, because Horus is the Egyptian eye. Right? Everyone knows that symbol, still, interestingly enough. So the Egyptians figured out, this is so cool. I've never recovered from figuring this out. It's what they discovered was so absolutely, unbelievably remarkable that it produced a whole religion and a whole culture that lasted thousands of years, right? Because that's what happened in Egypt. Horus is the eye. Now, what's the eye? The eye is paying attention. So the gods the Egyptians figured out that when things fell apart as a consequence of malevolence and everything fell into chaos, the right thing to worship was the ability to pay attention. So, and that's not the same thing as the ability to think. It's different. The ability to pay attention is before thinking. And the ability to pay attention is, oh, something's gone wrong here. I'm in a state of chaos. My marriage is falling apart, or we've had a bad fight, let's say, and I don't know what's going on. How am I going to figure out what's going on? How about if I pay attention, right? So, and you think, well, what do you have to do to pay attention? You have to think, well, the reason we're having a fight isn't because my wife is an ignorant bitch, although that's a very, well, what the hell are you going to think to begin with, right? You're going to think, I'm right, and she's wrong, because that's bloody convenient, because if she's wrong, then she gets to change, and you can just stay the same. That's right, exactly. You don't want to change, because you know, if you're going to change, something that you like doing, you're going to have to stop doing. That'll be the first thing. And so, and it won't be the last. You'll have to figure out why you're stupid and wrong. That's annoying. And then you'll have to rectify that, and then you'll have to tell her how you rectified it. It's like, God, that's so annoying. It's easier for her to be a stupid bitch. But then, definitely, but then you have a problem. And the problem is you have to live with a stupid bitch. Yeah, and so one of the things you might ask yourself is, if you do live with a stupid bitch, then perhaps
perhaps you deserve that. And not only that, perhaps you had a major hand in creating it. So, well, it's worth thinking about it, since we're, although who wants to think about that, man? Nobody. So what happens is, Isis makes herself pregnant, and she goes to the underworld. She goes to the underworld, and she gives birth to Horus. And Horus is a bunch of things. So he's the eye, first of all, but he's also a falcon. So, and that's a really interesting, do you remember the Lion King again? So, because it's a good way of making sense of this story. You know how the king Mufasa had that bird? I don't remember his name. Zazu, that's him, yeah. And he was the eye of the king. And so what did Zazu do? He went above everything, he flew above everything, and he watched everything. So he was the eye of the king. And so the Egyptians knew that Horus was the god of attention, and so Horus was a falcon. And the reason that Horus was a falcon is because falcons can see better than any other animal. They're the only creatures on the planet that can see better than human beings, birds of prey. So that's why they use the falcon as a symbol of paying attention. Now, so Horus grew up, and he was different than Osiris. Osiris was the god of tradition, blind, willfully blind, couldn't pay attention to his evil brother. He didn't notice that he was being threatened. Could have, but didn't, was willfully blind. And so he was overthrown by the forces of malevolence. Permanent problem in human history. Horus was born, and he's alert attention. He can see, but now he has a problem. What do you see when you can see? And the answer to that is, you see what you don't want to see. Right? Because, you know, it's easy to see what you want to see. It doesn't take any real vision to see what you want to see. To see what you don't want to see, that's a whole different story. And that's the thing about Horus, is he could see what he didn't want to see. And what he really didn't want to see was the nature of his evil uncle. And so he goes back to his kingdom, same story as the Lion King, again, by the way. He goes back to his kingdom and has a battle with his evil uncle to regain his kingdom. Which basically means that if you're going to pay attention, that's what you're going to do. Is you're going to encounter the, what would you say, the permanence of malevolence and ignorance. You're going to encounter that, and you're going to see it. And so Horus goes back and has a fight with Seth. And while they're fighting, Seth tears out one of his eyes. And there's a warning there too, which is that if you're going to see, you're going to pay a price for it. And the price might be so high that it actually damages your ability to see. So, and which is partly why people don't want to see. And it's no bloody wonder, because there are things that you can see that you do not want to see. And they're the things that really bring us down. They're the things that really do us in. And not only the things that other people are doing, tyrannical people, people who commit atrocities, murderers, that sort of people, but all the things you do in your own domain, all the parts of you that are malevolent, all the parts of you that aren't sorted out properly, that aren't serving the world properly. You take a good look at that, the probability is very, very high that it will damage your vision. And that's why people don't do it. So anyways, Horus has this terrible battle with Seth, and he banishes him to the nether regions of the kingdom. Can't kill him, no getting rid of him, because the malevolence and ignorance are a permanent part of existence, and there's no permanent solution. The best you can do is banish it temporarily, and he gets his eye back. And so then you might think, well, what does he do? Slaps his eye back in his head and rules. No, that's not what happens, and this is where the Egyptians really surpass themselves in their brilliance. Horus takes his eye and he goes down to the underworld. Again, it's the kingdom of the dead, essentially. And Osiris is down there, his father, but kind of dismembered and ghost-like, you know. And so Horus goes to find his father in the underworld, to rescue him from the belly of the whale, let's say, like Pinocchio does in the Pinocchio story. It's the same idea. And when he goes to find Osiris, he gives Osiris his eye. And that reanimates him. And so then Osiris and Horus go back out of the underworld, arm in arm, father and son. And it's their union that rules. And so for the Egyptians, the pharaoh, who had sovereignty, was the union of Osiris and Horus, the union of tradition and vision. It's so brilliant, it's so unbelievably brilliant. And they associated that with the immortal soul. That was the Egyptian idea, that the immortal soul was the union of tradition and vision. And so, well, that idea had an immense influence on the development of Judaism and an immense influence on the development of Christianity.
And so it's an idea that's way at the bottom of our culture. And there's something unbelievably profound about it, which is that's what you should be. You should be the union of tradition and vision. But that the price that you pay for that is that you'll pay attention, and the price of paying attention is that you will see things that you do not want to see. But the thing is, you can. That's the thing that's so remarkable, is that if you're willing to allow yourself to see the things that you don't want to see, you will discover that you can see them, and that you can actually tolerate that. And I would say we actually don't know a more deep clinical truth than that. So because I could take this out of the domain of metaphysical speculation, even though it's not precisely necessary to do so. If you're dealing with someone who's very anxious and who's stumped in their life, they can't move forward, they're stopped by their anxiety and their terror, what you do is you break down their terror into manageable pieces. You say, okay, what are you afraid of? Well, maybe I'm agoraphobic, I'm afraid of elevators and death. I know it's a big leap, man, but when an agoraphobic person looks at an elevator, they see it too. Like, it's death they're afraid of. They're afraid they'll get trapped in the elevator and they'll have a heart attack and they won't get to a hospital and they'll die. Or worse, they're afraid they'll be trapped in an elevator with a bunch of other people, that they'll have a heart attack and make a fool of themselves so that while they're dying, everyone will be looking at them. Right? So it's social judgment plus mortality all rolled up into one. And so, and really, this is the case. And you can understand that, because the two great fears are to be humiliated and to die. And so if you really want to be terrified, you want to be humiliated while you're dying. Right? Right. So, but then what you do with the person who's afraid is that you help them gradually encounter the thing that they're afraid of, and what they learn, so you expose them to the elevator, say in bits and pieces. First of all, they stand 10 feet from it, and then 5 feet, and then maybe they look inside it, and maybe they step inside it while you hold the doors open, and then maybe they travel down one floor, and they don't get less afraid, they get braver. Right, and this is also what you want for your children. That's rule 11. Don't bother children when they're skateboarding, because you don't want them to get less afraid. You want to get them to be braver. And you do that by exposing them to things that are beyond them and to encourage them. And that's what you do to people if you want to help them overcome their justifiable terror of existence. You find, well, if you expose people to challenges that are slightly beyond them in a rigorous manner, then they get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And we have no idea what the upper limit is to that. You can't discover an upper limit to that in a therapeutic session, because if you're dealing with someone, say, over a decade-long period. I had a client recently, when she first came to see me, she was so socially timid that even though I was her therapist, we couldn't go into a coffee shop to have a coffee together. That was not possible. And at the end of 10 years, and I'm not taking credit for this, by the way, she did this on her own, which is what you have to do if you're successful in psychotherapy. Anyway, she was doing stand-up comedy at clubs. It's like, right, man, that's a big difference. That's a big difference. So, and it's not because she became less afraid of people. It's because she discovered more and more about what she was actually capable of, despite the fact that she was afraid. And that's way better, because good luck getting rid of your terror. Now, that's just not going to happen, because there's endless things to be terrified about, and they are absolutely real. So the best you can hope for is courage, not a cessation of fear. And so, well, what's the underlying theme in 12 Rules for Life? Well, I've laid it out to some degree today, a discursive talk, but nonetheless, it's like, I suppose the fundamental theme, and I think the thing that makes this book different, perhaps, than what's being pushed forward by perhaps well-meaning psychologists, for some of them, for a while, is that I'm not particularly interested in whether or not people are happy, or whether or not they have rights, or really anything about even their freedom, I suppose. I'm much more concerned about their responsibility. And there's a reason for that, two reasons. One is, unless you shoulder your responsibility, things fall apart. And that's actually true. You fall apart, your family falls apart, and your community falls apart. And it's way worse that you don't shoulder responsibility than you think, because you have a lot more at your disposal than you think, for better or for worse. You're certainly, and you know this, because even if you're not so convinced that you could be a powerful force for good, you're bloody well convinced that you could be a powerful force for mayhem. And you certainly have been you know, in the mistakes that you've made in your life. You know how devastating your inaction can be for you and for your family, and hypothetically for the community. And so if you're that much of a force for catastrophe, it's conceivable that if you got your act together, you'd be that much of a force for the opposite. And I do really believe this is the case. I think the individual is far more powerful force for good and evil than any of us are willing to realize. And I don't think that we would have founded our entire culture on the proposition that sovereignty inheres in the individual if we wouldn't have figured that out at some point. Or is that just a game? Is that just a game that sovereignty inheres in the individual? Or is it real? The whole, your whole culture in particular, the Americans, you guys in particular, it's like it's explicit in the structure of your society. It's on you. And it's not because of your rights. It's because of the necessity for you to adopt responsibility for your own shortcomings and the shortcomings of everything around you. It seems to me that I think that's just a statement of fact, that that's how the world works. I think that that's why our cultures work, the cultures that are predicated on the sovereignty of the individual, because we got something right about that. But it's not rights, it's responsibility. But what's cool about that, and I'll end with this is what's so interesting about that. It's like, you know, I already said that, like Horace, you have reasons not to pay attention. You don't want to lose an eye, man. It's like you really want to pay attention to the terrible things that are going on around you or within you. It's very brutal. It's like, well, why bother? Well, here's a reason. It's like, you're stuck with the suffering in life. And you're stuck with the malevolence in life, which is associated with the suffering, right? I mean, you're in a fragile physical form. You're going to age and die. You're going to get sick. That's all going to happen. And then it's going to be made worse by your own foolish errors and the willful errors of people around you. There's no getting away from that. But the question is, well, what can you do in the face of that? I would say, well, you can pursue what justifies that, the suffering and the malevolence. And the answer to that is, you need to do something noble and worthwhile. You think, well, you know, despite the, what would you say, the unacceptability of existence, there are things that you can do that make it worthwhile, right? That make you want to get up in the morning when it's a hard morning to get up. You think, I've got things that are worth doing. It's like, well, where do you find the things that are worth doing? Well, it's not in impulsive pleasure and the seeking of every privilege you have because you have rights. And you know that. You don't admire people like that. And admiration is the spontaneous manifestation of your sense of how to orient yourself in the world. You admire people who take on the responsibility of life. They take care of themselves. And they have excess capacity, so they take care of people around them, their family. And maybe they can even transcend that. They take care of themselves, their family, and their community. And they have a reason to get the hell out of bed in the morning when it's a brutal morning. And everyone needs a reason to get out of bed in the morning when it's a brutal morning. Because the brutal mornings, if they're not here, they're coming. And so happiness isn't going to get that for you, because those aren't going to be happy mornings. And you need to be able to think to yourself, yeah, I'm going to haul myself up by the scruff of the neck because I got things to do that are worth doing. The world will be a less worthwhile place if I don't put my damn feet on the ground and move forward today and to take on the responsibility. And that's part of, let's say, standing up straight with your shoulders back, right? And to confront the world in a proper manner. And so, well, that's the fundamental ethos of 12 Rules for Life and the fundamental issue in chapter 1. And so that's for now. I'll come back for the Q&A, but that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much.
That is pretty incredible. All right, we're going to give him about a minute to relax. You guys submitted probably more questions than anyone else so far. They're going to bring you Jordan's computer in just a second. Everybody feeling good? You know, I realize I don't think in that hour and a half that Jordan enforced any monogamy on you people. Do we have any single people here? not an overly enthusiastic group of single people. Now, I know these audiences skew a little more male than female. We may have to enforce some gay monogamy. Is that... One guy, all right, one guy. That's happened. Guys, do we have the computer over here? Oh, Jordan's gonna bring it up. Bring it up. Give it up for Jordan Peterson, everybody. You're delivering me a computer, like a waiter. All right. So, I want to start with this one because there were about 100 questions like this, but I thought it was worded the best way. What do you think of all the soy boys across the street?
Across the street, really.
I think that you have to live with them. Well, that is what I think, you know. Like, look, I was on Bill Maher's show about 2 months ago, and it was interesting. It's interesting to come down to the States, because I really like the States. I lived here for about 6 years in Boston, and when the internet was taking off, it was real. Your country was just a bloody juggernaut there for about 8 years, and so that was really something to see. And but I have a little detachment as well, because I'm from a different country, you know, so I'm not quite as tangled up in the things you're tangled up. I'm tangled up in my own things, obviously. But well, I went down to see Bill Maher, and one of the things that was happening, he had a bunch of people who were more liberal leaning on the same program that I was on. And, you know, Maher liked my book because he's kind of a free speech guy, which is a good thing because he's a stand-up comedian, so he bloody well better be a free speech guy. So, but, you know, it does conflict to some degree with his more left-leaning proclivities. So he's trying to work that out. But I was sitting at the end, at the show at the end, they do this thing that just goes to YouTube, and there was a governor of Washington, I think it was the governor, and a couple of journalists, one from the New York Times and one from the Atlantic, and there was a fourth panelist who I don't remember, and they were just bashing the hell out of Trump. And I thought, well, first of all, it's not that hard. He's kind of a strange guy. It's not like anybody in here couldn't list 30 things about Trump that you could have issue with. So it doesn't take a tremendous amount of perspicacity to come up with a list about things you might find questionable about Trump. It's also not that interesting. You know, I went and saw John Cleese from Monty Python. I saw him in Toronto a couple of weeks ago, and he told stories about the meaning of life and about the Holy Grail and the life of Brian and the Monty Python shows, and that was so interesting, and no one could tell those stories except John Cleese. It was like, yay, I get to hear these stories. And then he started talking about Trump, and it was like listening to your great uncle talk about Trump. Who cares what he thinks about Trump? He thinks the same thing everyone else thinks about Trump. No. Anyways, so they were all squawking about Trump, and I was sitting there thinking, you Americans have voted 50% Republican and 50% Democrat for, 20 years, right? You did exactly the same thing in the last election. It's a 50-50 split. And so maybe you're more polarized than you were, and maybe you're not, but that hasn't shifted. And it's like, and so these people that voted for Trump, these reprehensible people, it's like, they're half your people. They're in your family. They're even in your head. Because you have to be a pretty blind liberal not to have wished when you went into the voting booth to say, oh, to hell with it, Trump. Right. And so the issue is how do you bring these people back into the fold? How do you get the dialogue going again? Because you're stuck with, the liberals are stuck with you Trump lovers, and you Trump lovers are stuck with the liberals. And the reason your country works is because you've been able to talk. And so the talking better continue, and that's what I would say about the people outside. I mean, I don't know what they're up to, what they're doing out there today. We don't like violent men. It's like, okay. Like, I don't know why that's particularly relevant in this particular circumstance. Well, Dave is one of the most violent men I've ever seen. When you see him in private, of course. But I think what you want to do is you don't want to win
any more than you want to win an argument with your spouse. Because if you win an argument with your spouse, then they lose. Then you're stuck with a loser. Right? And so you don't want to do that. You want to come up with a solution where you both win. And so that's the right way to deal with this. And I know it's very difficult to do that as the people you're talking to go farther and farther out on the ideological spectrum, right? At some point, maybe civilized discourse becomes impossible. But hopefully that doesn't happen too much. Because when that starts to happen too much, then the sides start to step farther and farther apart. And that's what I'm worried about right now, is that you see you can get a situation where it's like a feud or a vendetta. You know, I tap you, you slap me. I punch you, you hit me with a stick. It's like we're going. And that's a positive feedback loop. And like those positive feedback loops is like when you bring a microphone too close to a speaker, you know, and it starts to howl and it blows the whole system out because the input gets amplified. And we don't want to have that happen. We want to dampen it down. And I think you dampen it down by listening and through intelligent discourse. And I think maybe the real proper way to do this, I'm hoping, is that you tell a better story. Right? So someone's stuck in an ideology and it's got a narrative angle and it gives them some meaning. You got to come up with something that's more attractive. It's the best way, it's the best attraction forward. You know, and I'm hoping, at least in part, that this doctrine of voluntarily accepted individual responsibility as a pathway to meaning, because it's never put that way, generally speaking. It's usually a duty. You should accept responsibility. It's like, no, you need to accept responsibility because that's where you're going to find the meaning in your life. I'm hoping that that's a better story, and I believe that that's the fundamental story upon which your civilization is predicated in any case. And so we got to pull people back from that. So that's... Because the alternative, what's the alternative? The alternative is, well, maybe you get to punch someone. You know, and that's real gratifying, perhaps, when you're angry for like a 20th of a second. But as a medium to long-term political strategy, I wouldn't recommend it. It doesn't go good places, and those good places it doesn't go are really, really, really not good. And so let's not go there. Like, we don't need to go there again, yet again. So...
What's an issue that you thought you had figured out, but have since changed your mind on? Don't say punching people.
Well, I think one of the shifts, I had a shift when I was talking to Sam Harris, because Harris insists that values can be derived from facts, and I've been kind of hammering about that because there's a way in which that's not correct. But when I was thinking about how to communicate with him and to move the communication forward, I realized that when I wrote my first book, when I wrote Maps of Meaning, and it's in 12 Rules for Life too, I was actually trying to derive values from facts. I was doing it in a manner that was different than he recommended, and I think a more suitable manner, which still needs to be discussed with him. Because I think that what I laid out is how values were derived from facts over the evolutionary timeline, rather than over the timeline of a single life. You know, so Sam seems to think, and maybe this is wrong, that the facts are there and you can derive values from them. And I think, no, the facts are there, but they have to be there for a very long time, like who knows how long, 1 million years, 5 million years, 10 million years, I don't know, for you to derive acceptable values from the facts. And then the mechanism by which those values are derived is biologically instantiated. And it's, sorry, I know this is very complicated, but, and then it serves as the mechanism that determines which facts manifest themselves to you. So there is a connection between facts and values that I had glossed over in my attempts to make a case for the primacy of stories instead of facts. So that's one thing that's changed very recently, and so I think that's been helpful. I think it makes the situation clearer. I think it also perhaps opens the door for a more profound and lasting mediation between the
claims of the atheists and the claims of the religious. I think there's a biological solution to that argument. So that's one thing that I've been changing my mind about. I bet you didn't expect that it would be that.
Were Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy in an abusive relationship?
No more abusive than most.
This is interesting. How do you know when it's time to cut out a toxic friend?
Right. Well, that's a good example of the sort of thing we were talking about tonight, right? When you cut your losses. That's a good example of that terrible tension between structure, the continuation of the same thing, and transformation. Well, I can tell you an answer to that in bits. See, I can't give a canonical answer to that because the devil's always in the details, right? So if I was dealing with that problem in a clinical setting, I'd have the person lay out the whole story of the friendship and then lay out their strategies for dealing with it and then lay out a set of potential strategies. And if we couldn't come up with a potential strategy that seemed implementable that would salvage the relationship, then we would decide that perhaps we could explore stepping away from it. But the devil's in the details, right? That's a very particularized solution. And so trying to extract out a general rule of thumb from that is dangerous. But having said that, I can give you some general rules of thumb. So if you're dealing with an intransigent family member, let's say, who's stuck in a rut, and maybe is complaining about the rut all the time, but doesn't do anything to change it, and you've suggested changes, and you've suggested them 3 times, and nothing has happened, then I would say, stop suggesting changes. And because there's a New Testament statement, don't cast pearls before swine, which is a very rough statement, man. It's a harsh statement, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it because it's so harsh. It's like, okay, what does that mean? It means if people aren't listening to you, then shut up. Because you're not where you think you are, right? Because if you're having a conversation, and it's a real conversation, then I'm listening to you and you're listening to me. And if I'm talking and you're not listening, then I'm not where I think I am. And so there's just no sense doing it again. Now, you can also sometimes suggest to the person that they don't tell you that problem anymore. It's like, tell you what, you have this problem, I've heard about it 8 times. I've made some suggestions. None of them were implemented. We'll make a deal. You don't tell me the problem anymore, and I won't tell you any solutions to it. And then often what happens because of that is, and then you have to enforce it, right? Because they'll try to tell you the problems a few more times. You have to enforce it. Often what happens in that situation is the person will go away and think. You know, because the psychologists often call this enabling. Like if you allow the person to complain about the same problem without changing and just complaining, and you listen, then what you're doing is allowing them to pretend to themselves that they're trying to look for a solution. Because by telling you about the problem, part of what they're doing is acting as if complaining about it is a solution to the problem. But it isn't, because nothing's happening. But if you're listening, then you're acting out the part of someone who agrees with the proposition that they're trying to work towards a solution. And if you just say, hey, I'm not doing that anymore, then you deprive them of one piece of evidence that that's a useful solution. Especially if you actually love them too, because then you're a credible source. And then maybe they have to go back and think. It's like, oh, I see, that person won't put up with my nonsense anymore. Now, they're not going to be happy about that, but, well, some of them will be. Some part of them will be. But then sometimes they'll think, and then sometimes they'll come back to you with a different take. It might take a while. It might take 3 months. It might take 6 months, but that will often move something. So that would be a small-scale step away. And then I would say, too, is like, here's another hint. This is a broader hint for your life in general. It's like, let's say you have a person who's
burdening you a lot. And it looks kind of counterproductive in that it's hurting you and it's not helping them. Because that's kind of the calculus you're making, right? It's, when you're talking about a toxic friend, it's like the friend's life is all screwed up, and that's bad. But then that's screwing up your life, and maybe that's acceptable if there's some progress, but it's screwing up their life and your life, and it's getting worse and nothing's improving. It's not helpful. It's like, so how can you tell when you should step away from that? And I would say, notice if you're resentful. But I would also say, especially to you agreeable types who are always trying to help other people, and who will sacrifice yourself to do that, it's like, watch your resentment. Because agreeable people get resentful, and the reason they get resentful is because they allow themselves to be taken advantage of. It might also be because they're whiny and immature, so you ask yourself that first. I'm resentful, maybe I'm whiny and immature. Then you can go ask someone, here's the issue, I'm resentful, am I being whiny and immature? And they might say yes, and then you should fix that. But they might also say, no, you're being taken advantage of. It's like, well, if you're being taken advantage of, stop being taken advantage of. Because it's not acceptable for you to allow yourself to be taken advantage of. In Rule 2, I laid out this proposition that you should act towards yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. It's like you have an ethical duty to yourself to not be taken advantage of. It's not helpful to other people to allow them to take advantage of you. Maybe if they're 6-month-old infants, because they will take advantage of you, because what the hell choice do they have? But if they're like your 35-year-old brother, it's like he's not a 6-month-old infant. You don't have to let him take advantage of you. And if you're resentful, you're going to get brutal. Because resentful people take revenge. And they do it in subtle and not so subtle ways. And so once you hit the point of resentment, assuming you're not being whiny and immature, then you have to make a decision. And the decision should be, I'm not being taken advantage of anymore. And so then you take your toxic friend who's taking advantage of you and you say, look, you took advantage of me this way. And then you did it again this way. And then you did it again this way. You need 3 pieces of evidence, by the way. You can't just go after the person with 1 piece of evidence because they'll just rationalize it away. You got to collect your damn evidence. It also works well in the workplace or whenever you're having an argument with someone. 1 transgression you ignore. 2 transgressions you note. 3 transgressions you communicate. And then it makes you very deadly because you say, you did this. They say, no, I didn't. They said, yeah, you did. And then you did this, which was the same thing. And then I didn't even say anything then because I'm so patient. And then you did this, which was the same thing again. And then it's almost invariably the case that the person can't come up with enough rationalizations that quickly to justify doing 3 of the same things in different contexts. You usually win if you're that patient. And that's a good way of also dealing with your resentment. But so I would say, if you're being taken advantage of, you're going to get resentful, and that resentment is so useful, especially to agreeable people, that you can't believe it. It's one of those things you don't want to look at because it'll hurt your vision. Because you think, well, I'm such a nice person, I can't be resentful. It's like, you are not that nice. Don't kid yourself. So you're not. And so then you can consult your resentment, and in that you can find the strength to defend yourself. And that can separate you from people who will pull you down. You know how you approach someone who's drowning and panicking? Like this, right? And so you come up to them and you say, weirdly, because they're drowning, you say, calm down, because I'm not dying with you, right? And then if they come and grab onto you, push them away, because them dead and you dead, that's not better than just them dead. Right, exactly. And so it's the same in life. It's like, you know, you dead and them dead is not better than just them dead. And so also if you allow someone in that situation to pull you under, then they see that you don't value yourself enough to stop yourself from being pulled under, and that makes them even more hopeless about their own lives. So you have every reason to defend yourself against being pulled under. It's not helpful. And being nice and being compassionate and all of that, save it for the babies.
When's the you got really drunk?
Oh, well, probably a year ago, I have a friend in LA, and he likes bourbon, and so we drank a lot of it. Really enjoyed it. But it wasn't a good idea. Like so many things that you really enjoy.
What specific thing do you see as the biggest threat to free speech?
Hatred of the truth. That's it. You know, they say the truth will set you free, and it certainly will, but like, the question is, do you really want to be free? Because the kind of free that the truth provides for you is a freedom that's contingent on letting everything that isn't worthy in you burn to the ground. And that's not pleasant. And so people don't, you know this perfectly well. Whenever you learn something profound in life, which is a life-altering revelation, let's say, it comes at a cost. You say, oh, I sure learned that the hard way. It's like, yeah, you learn everything the hard way. If it's worth learning, you learn it the hard way. And so the truth is the hard way. And so, of course, people oppose its expression because it's the hard way. The only thing harder than the hard way is the way that isn't the truth. That's the problem. It's like, it's no wonder that people want to deceive and hide. The problem with that is that it's worse. It's worse. It's better to get the damn problem out in the open right now and to confront it voluntarily at a time of your own place, a time of your own and place of your own choosing. You let it aggregate because you're hiding, it will take you out. And I would also say that's another one of the most ancient stories of mankind. That's encapsulated in the Mesopotamian creation myth, which is the oldest story that we have. You let monsters breed in the dark, small monsters breed in the dark. They turn into something massive and it will take you out. And it'll wait till you're weak and hurt, and then it'll manifest itself. So, as terrible as the truth is, it's better than the alternative. And that's basically what we've got. So we've got a choice between those two terrors. And so the people who don't like free speech, they hate the truth. And it's no wonder, but it's not helpful. So. You know, it's even worse than that. It isn't even that they hate the truth so much. It's that they hate the process by which the truth comes to be. Because that's even more important than the truth, you know, because what's true now might be slightly different in a week, which is why you have to keep talking to the person you're married to, right? Because what worked yesterday isn't exactly the same thing as that's going to work today, so you have to update it. So there's this process of contending that actually constitutes the truth as such, because the truth isn't a set of propositions that will never die. The truth is a stance on life, like standing up straight with your shoulders back. And people who are opposed to free speech don't like the stance itself because it calls on them to be brave and responsible, and they avoid that. And you say, well, why would you avoid being brave and responsible? It's like, well, because it's easy to be lazy. It's easier to be lazy and weak, obviously. You know, doing hard things is hard. So why wouldn't you do them? It's like, well, that's a stupid question. It's easier to sit and do nothing than to bear a heavy load. So it's a nonsensical question. But yeah, the real enemies of free speech are the people who are enemies of the process by which the truth is revealed. It's worse than even enemies of the truth. It's worse than that. So.
All right, let's change someone's life tonight. I'm here with my 8-year-old son. He's very curious and concerned with what is going on with his generation. Can you speak at all to the children directly? Where is this 8-year-old? Where are you?
Hey, kiddo, what's your
name? Give this guy a round of applause, everybody.
What's your name, kiddo? Say again? Tabor, hi Tabor, how you doing? Look, so a couple of things. First of all, things are better now than they've ever been. And not only that, they're getting better faster than they've ever gotten better. So, as terrible as things are, they're way better than they were. And there's every reason to assume that that will continue. And so I would say, don't despair. Live in hope, kiddo. And and occupy yourself with the things that you should be occupied with when you're 8. Make your friends, have your fun, do well in school. That's how you contribute to making things better. And don't worry about things that are beyond that at the moment, because you've got enough to occupy yourself with being 8. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Everyone in this room is like, do me! Oh, as a lefty, I like this one. Do left-handed people carry a different perspective of the world since their dominant brain hemisphere is rooted in the unconscious?
No. They die more often, though.
Those damn scissors.
Yeah, it is. Well, because they're in a right-handed world, they're more accident-prone. So, no, there's not a lot of credible evidence that handedness plays a profound role in personality. There's some quirks, partly because there's multiple reasons for being left-handed. So, but generally, what happens is that a right-handed brain is organized, and this is 2 hemispheres in case you were wondering. A right-handed person's brain is organized in a particular manner with certain modules in the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. That's the standard neurological configuration. Left-handed person's brain isn't organized that way, but they have the same modules. They're just put in slightly different places. So there isn't a tremendous amount of difference between left-handers and right-handers, apart from their proclivity to die in accidents.
I'm not sure you're using the word proclivity, right?
Unfortunate proclivity? Yeah.
All right, we can do 2 more here. I've moved farther right over recent years, but my wife is still an ardent left-wing feminist.
Somebody out there knows who's being talked about.
How do I keep my views while avoiding relationship troubles?
Well, first, you can't avoid relationship trouble. So, but look, I would say most of the proper concerns for an intimate relationship are intimate concerns, right? So it isn't obvious to me how much the political has to enter the local. I think that what you try to do is to solve the problems that directly confront you. It's like, look, when I'm helping someone straighten out their marriage, let's say, we do very mundane things, you know. We first of all try to calculate, what do you actually do together as a couple? And this is, you know, people think, well, we go to movies, we go to plays, we go to see friends. So I don't care about any of that. That's not relevant. You hardly ever do that. That's irrelevant. What I'm wondering is, what interrelationships do you have that constitute the bulk of your usage of time? Well, that's easy. You eat together. You do that every day. It's like, there's 5 hours a day. That's right. It's 35 hours a week. So that's a whole work week every week that you eat together. And so that's, let's see, 40 hours a week. It's 160 hours well, we'll leave it at that. Maybe, well, I can't do the math at the moment because I'm a bit tired, but it's a third of your bloody life. You're only awake for 16 hours a day. You spend a third of your life eating with your spouse. Get it right. So what else?
You come home every day. That takes 10 minutes. Somebody meets you at the door, or not. How does that go? Did they meet you at the door nicely? Have you got that figured out? It's 10 minutes a day. It's an hour a week. It's 4 hours a month. It's 50 hours a year. It's 1 work week. You spend 1 work week a year getting greeted at the door. Have you got that down? Have you figured out how to go shopping together? It's like there are things you do together that are mundane things. So those are the things you do every day. But they're your whole life. You get those things together. And then don't worry about the political stuff. It's secondary. So I would say, and it'll fix the political stuff anyways. If you get all that local stuff set out right so that your meals together are enjoyable and you distributed the domestic duties so that you're both happy about it. That's a war, man. You try to do that, that's a war. You get that everybody laughs. It's like, yeah, it's a war we haven't solved yet. It's like, no kidding. No kidding. There's a Canadian poet, Leonard Cohen, he has a famous song about the homicidal bitching that goes down in every kitchen about who is going to serve and who's going to eat. It's like, yeah, no kidding. It's a bloody, really, it's an absolute minefield in most households. You know, and that's because people haven't talked it through. It's like, well, how do you want the mealtime to go? Do you want to be at each other's throats metaphysically? Or do you want to sit down and have a lovely meal every day because you're going to do it 3 times? It's like, well, what are the preconditions for having a lovely meal? Everybody isn't feeling oppressed. Yeah. Yeah, no kidding, you know. But it's not so easy to have a meal in peace. It's not so easy. And you can think, well, there's the fundamental political problem. How do you have a meal in peace? Solve that, man. You've got 1/3 of your life fixed if you solve that. And so really, you really do. It's really hard to solve, right? Because it means you have to have consciously sorted out the hierarchy of responsibilities between the sexes in the household. It's like, good luck taking that on yourself. You know, because there used to be gender roles to deal with that. Now there aren't. So what do people do? They fight stupidly. That's what they do. And the alternative to that is to actually negotiate every damn detail. Who buys what? Who does the groceries? Who does the who does the groceries? Who prepares the meals? When do they prepare the meals? What's that worth in terms of trade-off for other tasks? How do you thank someone for operating properly in the kitchen? Who loads the dishwasher? Who does the dishes? When do they do the dishes? How fast do the dishes have to be cleared off the table after you eat? Which dishes are we going to use? What are we going to eat? What's the role the kids are going to play? Do we sit down together? Do we have regular meal times? It's like, each of those is a bloody war. And it's a political war. If you get that right, then you'll solve the political problems, because it's way easier to solve the political problems than it is to get all those things straight, that's for sure. So start by getting those things straight and see what happens. Then you'll have peaceful meal times, and then maybe you won't die.
I kind of want to end with this one. Several people wanted to know why the Blazers drafted Sam Bowie instead of Michael Jordan. What's next for you after this tour?
Well, you're assuming this tour is going to end.
I just extended a couple months, right?
Yeah. So we announced 20 more American cities today. But I think because my wife is traveling with me and is very, very helpful in all of this. Yeah, well, that's something too, because she's actually on board with this, you know, and some of that's a consequence of having had a very large number of fights. I'm serious, man, like hundreds of them. But they were fights with a purpose, and the purpose was so that we could fight it out until we had a solution, so we didn't have to fight about that thing anymore. And the solution was that one we jointly agreed on. And so one of the consequences of that, and that's taken a very long time, and it's a never-ending process, you know, because you encounter complex things when you're a couple, and the solutions to them aren't obvious, and one person thinks one thing and the other person thinks another thing, and who the hell knows who's right? So You have to have a struggle about it, and you have to come up with a consensus, and it's really hard. But I'll tell you a couple of the advantages to that have been advantages to me. So because we had sorted out, we've been married almost 30 years now, and we've had our fights about many, many things, but always made peace, because it doesn't matter if you fight. You have to fight. What matters is whether or not you make peace as a consequence of the fight. That's what matters. And to make peace is to come to a negotiated solution. And so we came to a negotiated solution about a lot of things. And some of that was really helpful because we had done that. My daughter got really ill for about 5 years. It was an absolute bloody catastrophe. But we weren't at each other's throat during it. And thank God, because it would have sunk us, for sure, because we were pushed right to our limit. And had we had 300 unresolved fights, we would have been done. And then in the last 2 years, when all this political stuff emerged, it's been quite the chaotic mess. And we had things in our family pretty sorted out. And because of that, we weren't at each other's throats while all of this political stuff came down. And at the same time that happened, I had a lot of health problems. And now there was a reason I was telling you all this. It was related to what I was doing next. So anyway, we've been able to pursue this tour. That was the whole point of this, and to add these 20 cities, and that's working really well. And I wanted to tell you that story because I wouldn't be able to do this without her help, and she wouldn't be able to help me unless we had got things sorted out, because she's been able to throw her full support behind all of this, and that was necessary in order to do it right. So that was all real useful. We haven't figured out, yeah, that was it, because I said we haven't figured out what we're doing next, because the situation is changing so dynamically that it's not really easy to figure out what the right thing is to do next. You know, I don't know. This is certainly uncharted territory for me. It's like, what the hell are all you people doing here? You know, it's not obvious at all. None of this is obvious. And so it seems to me, though, that like I'm enjoying these talks, and the audience seems to be enjoying them, and you seem to be enjoying them, and so we're going to keep doing that because it looks like a good thing. And then probably what I'll do is go back and write another book at some point, probably an extension to the one I just wrote.
BuzzFeed headline tomorrow, Jordan Peterson tells alt-right crowd, what the hell are you doing here? All right, man, well, I'm going to get out of the way here and let them applaud for you, but you know, there's been a couple shows along the way that I felt like things kind of leveled up, and I think tonight was one of them. So on that note, I'm going to scooch this way, give it up for Dr. Jordan Peterson, everybody.